What's up guys, it's Topsy and we are finally back to talking about my custom SpeedDuel box, A Journey Through the Stars. It's been a minute since I've actually talked about my set and going over all the decks in it since the release of all the information regarding the Battle City Finals SpeedDuel set. But in today's video, we're going to be talking about one of the decks that I'm the most excited about talking about, that of course being Dark World. A strategy that I'm surprised we never actually got actualized in SpeedDuels, given the fact that we had the set regarding Dark Jaden, and that just felt like such a perfect area to put that deck in. And honestly, Dark World is one of those cool strategies that don't see enough play because of the nature of the formats they're introduced in. But I'm hoping that with today's deck, I'm gonna have like a perfect spot for it to be somewhat viable in speed duels without being outright broken. But with all that being said guys, if you do end up enjoying today's video, then a like and a subscribe would be very much appreciated. I am trying to get this channel to 500 subscribers by the end of the year, and we actually are getting pretty close to that. So with all that being said, let's jump right in. Alright guys, so here we are, and as I said at the beginning of the video, I am so excited to talk about this deck. Dark World is one of my all-time favorite strategies, and it's such a shame that we never ended up getting it in speed duels. So before we go ahead and break down the whole deck in itself, I first want to go ahead and break down each of the skills so we understand what the deck is trying to do. Starting off with the canon skill of the deck, that of course being a passage to the Dark World, and the skill reads: once per turn, you can discard one fiend monster to add one, the Gate of Dark World, from your deck or graveyard to your hand. This skill can only be used twice per duel. And this skill I like a lot just because it's a very simple field spell searcher for this deck, because one of the most important aspects of the Dark World strategy is that you need a discard outlet. And if you don't get one, the deck struggles like a lot, and it's very difficult to play with this deck. So I figured a way of tying a skill to the deck where you're forced to discard a fiend monster in order to get your field spell felt like a really good way of doing so. Also, in addition, the way that I wrote this skill pretty much makes it to where you're not proccing any of the effects of the Dark World monsters, so it doesn't feel outright unfair, the activation of this card. As a whole, I think this does pretty much anything you would want to give to a skill dedicated for this deck. As for the other skill we have here is Lord Rainbow Rise, and I actually like this skill a lot too. Alright, this skill reads: once per turn, if Rainbow, Overlord of the Dark World, is in your graveyard, you can special summon it from your graveyard by returning one level 6 or lower Dark World monster you control to the hand. And essentially what we did here is that we gave Rainbow the ability of both its evolved version, I forgot the name of it, but Rainbow has a remake of it that came in the newest structure deck for Dark World, and the ability of Silva as well. Not Silva, my bad, I meant Grapha. Both Grapha and the remake of Rainbow felt way too strong for speed duels as a whole, but Rainbow, the base version of it, is a really bad card, so a way to make it more viable is giving it some staying power on the field by being able to special summon itself from the graveyard. I think as a whole, this ability of it makes it somewhat balanced and makes it feel like an actual viable boss monster for the strategy. And yeah, and that's one of the things that I like a lot about it. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Rainbow was like the boss monster of the deck in this arc and played a pretty significant role because I think it was part of the fusion material for Colorless, one of the cards that we never ended up seeing in the anime, but we ended up getting in the TCG. So I felt like it was a very much needed thing for the deck to make this card be a boss monster, so I like the way that this skill ended up coming out. But in the comment section below, give me your thoughts on both these skills. Do you like one over the other? Do you think they're both pretty solid? Give me all your thoughts. Alright then, so now that we've covered both the skills for this strategy, it's time to break down the deck, and let's go ahead and start off with all the monsters in it. Starting off, we have some of the smaller monsters, cards like Scar, Scout of the Dark World. Surprised we never ended up getting this card, but I like it a lot just because it's a card that pays homage to like the slow nature of speed duels, because on destruction, it gets to search out a Dark World monster, and at that, it's a level 4 lower Dark World, which seems like a very fair effect for the cards. Next up, we have the back row and monster removal of the strategy, that of course being both Gren and Kaki. Both these cards I think are really cool, and once you start being able to activate them with cards like Dark World Dealings, Dark World Lightning, you get some pretty nutty effects going on in conjunction with each other. Moving down some more, we have some other classic Dark World monsters like Brow. This card's just here for consistency, being able to draw you a card upon being discarded, and if it's discarded by your opponent's card effect, it draws you two. Honestly, I think this card is fine. It's just a way to give the deck a lot more consistency, and I don't think it's broken in any means. Moving on, we have Beige. Beige is another really cool card, just because it gives you a body on field when it's discarded by card effect, and that's really nice. It's not a huge monster, so it doesn't feel like unfair for the swarming ability of it. Moving down, we have Braun, Mad King of the Dark World. Another cool card. It's already in SpeedDuel, so it's an easy add-in as well. Not only that, but Braun was the guy dueling against Jaden in this arc, so he had to be included in this strategy. And I think as a whole, this card's awesome in this deck, just because he's another way of facilitating the effects of you being able to discard. So this card feels really good in this deck. Moving on, we have Snow. So Snow is one of those really interesting cards because it's very powerful, but the nature of its power is very much dependent on what cards are available for the strategy. And I felt really good about adding this card as the power card in the strategy. Essentially all Snow does, if it's discarded by card effect, it searches you out a Dark World card, anything essentially, which is really strong. But if it's discarded by your opponent, then it's able to go ahead and special summon a card from your opponent's graveyard, which is really strong, but not necessarily broken, because it relies on your opponent playing some pretty decent cards in their deck, and also for them to have something in their graveyard. So I think as a whole, Snow feels fairly balanced for what it is. And that's pretty much all these small monsters in the strategy. I think as a whole, these all work really well. There were some other ones that I considered adding, like Ceruli, but I feel like the addition of Ceruli makes things get a little crazy, just because of the nature of it being able to facilitate a lot of really unfair stuff in the deck. And I didn't necessarily want to open that can of worms. Alright, so let's move on to the big boys of the deck. We have Silva and Gold. Silva, if you know this card, you know this card. It has this really strong ability where it's able to spin back 2 cards from your opponent's hand into their deck, which is really unfair. But in this deck in particular, it's very difficult to pull that off consistently on your own. So this card feels just fine in this deck. Of course, we also have Gold, which has another very unfair effect, but it's very balanced because you're not going to be able to pull it off on your own very consistently. Which is able just to pop 2 cards on the field, which is extremely strong in SpeedDuels. I think as a whole, I love the addition of these 2 cards in the way they're being included in this deck. Also, if I'm not mistaken, these 2 cards were also part of the anime, so it felt just right putting them in here. And of course, last card here, we have Rainbow Overlord of the Dark World. As a whole, yeah, I like this card a lot. It's a shame that it's not a good card because its only effect is based on your opponent discarding him, which goes ahead and stacks both the abilities of being able to special summon itself and or having the ability to either destroy all monsters on field or all back rolls on your opponent's field. Really powerful effects, but again, it's very difficult to get it discarded by your opponent's card effect. So I feel like the addition of the skill with this card makes it somewhat more viable. As a whole, I'm a pretty big fan of the monster lineup I chose. I think I chose a decent cast of monsters while adding some powerful cards like the Snow to make the deck feel a lot more viable. And without adding cards that are too broken, that makes it feel unfair and unfun. So I'm pretty happy with this monster roster. Alright then, now it's time to move on to all the spell cards in this strategy. Starting off with the card that we already have in the game, that of course being Dark World Lightning. Of course, it's another way of removing back row, so it's an addition in this deck, and it's just a good card overall. Next card up, we have Gateway of the Dark World, a way to recover a card from your graveyard. And it's a pretty restrictive special summon as well, because upon the summon of your Dark World monster, you can't summon anymore that turn, so that seems like a fair trade-off. Next up, we have Dark World Puppetry. This is one of the newer pieces of support for the deck, but I feel like in SpeedDuels, it feels fine. And essentially, all it does is it's able to target multiple cards, 3 in particular, in either graveyard and banishes them. We already have a card in the deck that does that, that I didn't include, and I think it's like Dark Corridor or something like that. I forget, but it does the same thing, and it's already in SpeedDuels. So a spell version of that feels just fine as well. And I feel like there could be some really interesting stuff that could happen in the meta if this card was around. So I ended up adding it. Of course, next card up is Gateway of Dark World. This card is so crucial for the strategy to be viable, and we already made a skill around it as well, so it's an easy add-in. Last spell up is Dark World The Dealings. This is one of those cards that I had to really think about whether or not I wanted to add into the game, just because it's such a generic draw spell, but in the end, I decided that I think it's okay just because we have cards like Allure in the game as well. And if it ever got out of control, you could always just like semi-limited and that could easily fix it. So that's why I feel like it's probably okay in the deck. And that's pretty much all the spell cards. Alright then, let's go ahead and wrap up with the trap cards now. Starting off with Dark Deal. Dark Deal, I don't think it's particularly good, but it is one of the ways that you're able to facilitate the discard effect by forcing your opponent to make you discard when they activate a spell card. And I think that's like a pretty fun way of doing this, so that's a pretty cool interaction. Next card up is Dark World Brainwashing. There's another way of forcing your opponent to make you discard, but it does take a lot more work, and it seems like as a whole, this card, I don't think it's a particularly good card, but maybe in Speed Duels, it could be a lot more viable. Especially in this deck where pretty much everything in this strategy is Dark World cards, so it could come up a lot more often than not. Up next, we have Mind Crush. This just fits the deck. I think it's one of those cards that was added to the original structure deck, and I think in the remake as well. And if I'm not mistaken, I probably am, but I feel like Braun might have used this against Jaden, but I could be wrong. Nevertheless, I think it's a card that just fits the strategy really, really well, and it's already a card that exists in Speed Duels, so it felt like a really easy addition to the strategy. Moving on, we have the Forces of Darkness. This is a really, really cool card for you to be able to recover resources from your graveyard by adding 2 Dark World monsters back to your hand. This fact I like a lot just because cards like Snow can be added back to your hand, maybe like the Grand, the Cocky, in order to be able to get rid of your opponent's back row. So I think it's a really, really nice card, because not all your Dark World monsters are able to recover themselves on their own. So being able to have a card that does that for you is a really cool addition. Last card up we have is Dark Scheme. This is one of those cards that I often forget is actually a card that exists in the game, and I like it a lot. It's a very powerful draw trap card that is pretty easy to play around just because it does give your opponent the out. But if they don't decide to negate it, both players essentially discard 2 to draw 2 cards. That's really, really strong, especially for Dark World. So this card feels really good in this deck. In addition, it also has Silva in the artwork, so I feel like this card just needed to be here. As a whole, I love this card. It's great and it's cool nevertheless. And yeah, guys, that's pretty much the breakdown for this Dark World deck. As a whole, I am really happy with it. In my opinion, I feel like if this was an actual Speed Duel deck, it would be incredibly fun to play with. But that's just me. I'm very biased because it's Dark World, and as I said, it's one of my all-time favorite strategies. So I do have that bias. Put in the comment section below, give me your thoughts. Do you like the cards that I chose? Is there any changes you would have personally made, etc, etc. I love reading all your guys' comments. But yeah, guys, if you guys did end up enjoying today's video, a like would be very much appreciated, and a subscribe as well. As usual, guys, have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll catch you on the next one. Bye.